Now, the European Council President Donald Tusk has called for tougher screening measures to deal with the spiralling refugee crisis. In an interview with several British newspapers, Tusk said refugees should be detained for up to 18 months in centres across Europe upon arrival. He called the move in line with international and European law, noting that the measure is required to screen refugees for security and terrorism risks. Tusk further slammed Merkel's open-door policy on refugees as dangerous. The European Council President urged EU member states to adopt a common approach to tackle the crisis. Some 850,000 asylum seekers, mostly fleeing wars in the Middle East and North Africa, have entered the continent this year. Well, to discuss that further, I joined Mr. Wahid Azal, who is an independent scholar and political commentator, and he's joining us live now by Skype from Berlin, as always. Thanks for joining us. How do you feel about this 18 months in detention centres?
Well, it's quite draconian, but what is irksome is that this kind of talk has resonances to the kind of draconian refugee policies of Australia that have been very markedly criticized in the past by many European governments themselves. And so Mr. Tusk is just reiterating this. This is very strange to me.
And you're sitting in Berlin, so it seems appropriate to ask you this question. He went after Angela Merkel, said that her open-door policy is a mistake. How do you feel about that?
Well, there's a history here. When Tusk was Prime Minister of Poland, he felt kind of sidelined during the initial Eurozone discussions back in 2011 and 12. And the way I'm reading this is that, now that he's the European Council President, it's sort of a payback time for him at the time when Merkel is actually quite weak internally.
And so what does this say for Europe going forward? Because, obviously we see the West, at least some people see the West as, the moral authority in the world. We've seen all this rhetoric coming out of the West just recently, especially Europe, again, with this refugee crisis. Has it lost its moral standing?
Completely. It's completely lost the moral standing. I mean, notice that he's not actually saying anything about the causes of the refugee crisis itself. And he's actually got into a bit of a dispute with the International Organization of Migration over the numbers. They're claiming that 64% of the people crossing from Turkey into the EU by the Greek islands last month in October were Syrians. So that's 388,000 people of a total of 608,000. A quarter of those making the crossing apparently are children, and there were 12 deaths in the past week. He is completely disputing all of these figures and saying, no, these figures are not true, although these, the IOM actually has raw data figures on the ground. So this is all about politics now.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there at that point, but of course, as always, we do sincerely appreciate you putting that all into context for us. That was Mr. Wahid Azal, who had been speaking to us live from Berlin.
Very much.